Margaret Thompson had been married to Richard for 38 years. At 63, she'd built a life filled with family dinners, garden parties, and the quiet comfort of routine. Their son, David, lived just 2 blocks away with his wife, Vanessa. Margaret thought she knew every corner of her world. One Tuesday morning, Margaret called David about the security camera mounted above their garage. It had been acting strangely, flickering on and off for days. Richard was away on one of his frequent business trips, so she'd reached out to their usual technician, Sam Martinez, who'd maintained their home systems for years. "Mom, I'll come by this afternoon," David had said. "We'll check it together." Margaret smiled, grateful for her son's attentiveness. She spent the morning baking his favorite lemon cake, the way she always did when he visited. The kitchen filled with the sweet scent of citrus and sugar, reminding her of when David was small, standing on a stool beside her, learning to crack eggs. When David arrived at 2 o'clock, Vanessa was with him. They seemed tense, exchanging glances Margaret couldn't quite read. Still, she served them cake and coffee, chatting about the neighborhood book club and her plans for the autumn garden. "Should we check that camera, Mom?" David finally said, his voice unusually tight. Margaret nodded, leading them to Richard's home office where the security system monitor sat on the mahogany desk. She'd never been particularly interested in the technology. Richard handled all of that. But lately, she noticed the red recording light blinking at odd hours. David sat down at the desk, his fingers moving across the keyboard. Vanessa stood behind him, her hand resting on his shoulder. Margaret busied herself collecting the coffee cups, humming softly. Then the humming stopped. The silence in the room changed. It became thick, suffocating. Margaret turned slowly, still holding the cups, and saw her son's face. He'd gone pale, his jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscles working beneath his skin. Vanessa's eyes were wide, one hand covering her mouth. "What is it?" Margaret asked, though something inside her already knew. Some instinct, some ancient feminine wisdom that recognizes betrayal before the mind can process it. David turned the monitor toward her without speaking. On the screen, recorded from their own garage security camera, Margaret saw her husband of 38 years. Richard's silver hair caught the overhead light as he leaned against his car, his arms wrapped around a woman Margaret had never seen before. She was younger, perhaps 40, with auburn hair and a red dress that seemed too bright, too alive for the gray garage. They were kissing, but it was more than that. It was the way Richard touched her face, the tenderness in the gesture, the same way he used to touch Margaret decades ago, before life became routine. The timestamp showed it was from 3 days earlier. When Richard had told Margaret he was leaving early for a conference in Chicago, Margaret set the coffee cups down carefully on the desk, her hands surprisingly steady. She watched herself in that moment, as if from a distance. She'd expected to cry, to rage, to crumble. Instead, she felt a strange calm wash over her, cold and clear as winter water. "Mom?" David's voice cracked. He was crying, this grown man, her baby boy, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry. I should have told you before I even looked. I should have." "How long?" Margaret interrupted, her voice quiet, but firm. "Keep watching. I need to know how long." Vanessa made a small sound of protest, but David understood. He scrolled backward through the footage. 2 weeks, 5 weeks, 3 months. The meetings were regular, almost scheduled. Always when Richard claimed to be traveling for work. 6 months. The affair had been going on for 6 months, recorded in perfect digital clarity by the very security system Richard had insisted they install for Margaret's safety. "That's enough," Margaret finally said. She smoothed her hands down her skirt, a simple gesture she'd performed countless times, suddenly aware of how ordinary she must look. Gray hair she colored every 6 weeks, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, comfortable shoes. When had she become this person who could be so easily replaced? David stood, reaching for her, but Margaret stepped back. Not out of anger at him, never at him, but because if he hugged her now, the dam would break, and she wasn't ready for that yet. "I need you both to go home," she said softly. "Please, Mom? We can't leave you alone, Vanessa." said, finding her voice. Let us stay. Or come home with us. Margaret shook her head. I need to think. I just need some time. After they left, reluctantly, with promises to call every hour, Margaret walked through her house. Really walked through it, seeing it with new eyes. The life she'd built was everywhere. Her grandmother's china in the cabinet Richard always said was too old-fashioned. The photos lining the hallway, David's graduation, family vacations to Cape Cod, Richard receiving his company's award for 30 years of service. Margaret stood before each one, studying Richard's face, looking for signs she'd missed. Had he been unhappy? Had she failed him somehow? No, the thought came to her clearly, firmly. This wasn't about her failing. This was about choices. His choices. That night, Margaret didn't sleep in their bedroom. She made up the guest room, lying in the dark with her eyes open, planning. She'd been a high school mathematics teacher. Before retiring 5 years ago, she understood problems and solutions, variables and constants. She just needed to figure out what kind of problem this was. By morning, she had her answer. When Richard returned from his business trip 2 days later, Margaret greeted him at the door with a smile. She kissed his cheek, took his suitcase, asked about his flight. Everything normal, everything as it had always been. How was Chicago? She asked, setting his favorite pot roast on the table for dinner. Exhausting, Richard said, loosening his tie. Conference ran long every day, but productive. Margaret nodded, passing him the potatoes. I'm glad it went well. David stopped by while you were gone. The security camera was acting up. She watched Richard's hand freeze for just a moment before he recovered. Oh, is it fixed? Sam took a look. Turns out it was working perfectly all along, just storing too much footage. All those months of recordings were taking up space. The color drained from Richard's face. Margaret continued eating her pot roast, taking small, deliberate bites. Margaret, I transferred all the important files to a secure drive, she continued calmly. For safekeeping. You never know when you might need a good backup. The silence stretched between them like broken glass. How long have you known? Richard finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Long enough. Margaret set down her fork, meeting his eyes. Her name is Christine. She works in your company's marketing department. You've been seeing her for 6 months. You meet in our garage before your trips. And I imagine other places too. You told me you were in Chicago last week, but your car was recorded here at 3 in the morning. Richard's shoulders slumped. For a moment, he looked old, all his charisma and confidence drained away. I never meant to hurt you, but you did. Margaret's voice remained steady, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. You made a choice, Richard. Every time you lied, every time you touched her, every time you came home and pretended everything was fine, those were choices. I don't love her, Richard said desperately. It was a mistake. A stupid stop. Margaret held up her hand. I don't want your excuses. I want you to pack a bag and stay at a hotel tonight. Tomorrow, you'll call David and tell him the truth. Then you'll call our lawyer. Margaret, please. 38 years I was faithful. 38 years I trusted you. 38 years I built a life thinking we were building it together. Margaret stood, her chair scraping against the floor. You destroyed that, not me. You. Richard left that night, and Margaret watched him go from the same window where she used to wait for him to come home. Years ago when David was small, and she'd count the minutes until her family was whole again. The divorce took 8 months. Margaret's lawyer was efficient and thorough. The house was hers. Half of everything else too. David stood beside her through every court appearance, his anger at his father palpable and protective. The day the papers were finalized, Margaret's sister, Patricia, flew in from Seattle. They sat in Margaret's kitchen, her kitchen now, truly hers, drinking wine and eating chocolate. How do you feel? Patricia asked gently. Margaret considered the question. Free, she said finally. Sad and angry and hurt, yes, but also free. I spent so many years being who I thought I should be. The good wife, the proper hostess, the woman who makes everything comfortable for everyone else. She looked around her kitchen, at the changes she'd already made. New curtains in a color Richard would have hated. Her paintings on the walls instead of his corporate art. Plants everywhere, green and alive and wild. I'm 64 years old, Margaret continued, and I have no idea what comes next. That used to terrify me. Now, she smiled, surprising herself with how genuine it felt. Now, I think it might be the most exciting thing that's ever happened to me. Patricia raised her glass. To new beginnings. To new beginnings, Margaret echoed. 6 months later, Margaret sold the house. Too many ghosts, too many memories of a life that no longer existed. She bought a smaller cottage near the coast, with a garden that needed taming and windows that looked out over the ocean. David worried, wanting her closer, but Margaret assured him she was fine. Better than fine. She joined a local art class, discovering she had a talent for watercolors. She volunteered at the library reading to children every Thursday afternoon. She made new friends, women her age who'd also rebuilt their lives after loss and betrayal and heartbreak. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, Margaret would sit on her porch with a cup of tea, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. She'd think about Richard, about Christine, about the security camera that had captured the end of one life and the beginning of another. She didn't forgive him. Maybe someday she would, maybe not. But she'd learned something more valuable than forgiveness. She'd learned that she didn't need him, that she never had. The betrayal had broken her heart, yes, but it had also freed her from a comfortable cage she hadn't even known she was in. And as the sun set over the ocean, painting the world in colors she'd never taken the time to appreciate before, Margaret Thompson smiled. She was finally, truly, home.